I thought buying my first home meant the end of being dismissed by my family. I never expected my father to use it as a final commodity to save his rotting business empire. Worse, the notary seal on the forged sale documents belonged to my best friend. But what my father failed to understand is that when you back a woman into a corner, she does not collapse. She flips the entire board. I am Evelyn Phelps. I am 33 years old, and for the past 7 years, my life has been measured in overtime hours, skipped vacations, and ruthless financial discipline. Working as a contract risk control specialist at Alderbridge Logistics trains you to see the hidden liabilities in every agreement. It forces you to look for the loopholes, the escape clauses, and the quiet ways people try to shift the blame when things go wrong. That level of constant vigilance bleeds into your personal life. You learn to trust nothing but the paper you sign and the money you hold in your own bank account. That precise, defensive mindset is what finally handed me the keys to a beautiful red brick 3-bedroom bungalow in the quiet, tree-lined streets of Briar Glen, a modest but fiercely independent neighborhood in Marlow County. This housewarming party was never meant to be a loud, drunken celebration. For me, it was a quiet, definitive declaration of survival. I had scraped together the 20% down payment entirely on my own. I worked late into the evenings, took on exhausting freelance consulting projects every single weekend, and lived on a daily budget so tight it practically choked me. I tracked every dollar I spent on groceries, gas, and utilities. I did all of this to ensure that I would never, under any circumstances, have to ask my family for a financial rescue. Standing in my new kitchen, wiping down the flawless white quartz countertops with a damp cloth, I felt a profound sense of ownership. Every single brick in the walls, every asphalt shingle on the roof, every square foot of polished hardwood floor belonged entirely to me. It was the physical, undeniable proof that I had built my own foundation from the ground up. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my quiet thoughts. I wiped my hands on a fresh towel and walked to the front door, expecting the usual chorus of cheerful congratulations from my arriving guests. Instead, I opened the heavy wooden door to find my father, Graham Phelps, standing on the porch. He stepped over the threshold, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the entryway floor. There was no warm embrace. There was no proud smile. There was not even a simple, obligatory word of congratulations for his daughter. His sharp eyes bypassed the carefully chosen living room furniture entirely. He did not notice the freshly painted sage walls or the warm natural light pouring in through the large bay windows. Instead, he walked straight past me without a word, his gaze locked firmly on the back of the house. He moved purposefully toward the sliding glass doors that led to the patio, his posture rigid with sudden calculation. He stood there for several long moments, his eyes scanning the exact width of the lot. He muttered something under his breath about the rear driveway access and the deep setback of the wooden fence line. He pointed out the wide, empty space near the detached garage, noting aloud to the empty room that there was more than enough square footage to build something extra, perhaps a lucrative accessory dwelling unit or a massive structural extension. He was not looking at the home his daughter had bled for. He was appraising a raw parcel of land. I swallowed the hard knot of disappointment in my throat and forced a polite smile, guiding my guests toward the dining area as they arrived. The evening progressed with steady, polite chatter and the gentle clinking of expensive wine glasses. We sat around my newly purchased dining table, sharing heavy platters of roasted root vegetables and perfectly carved meats. At my right sat Rowan Mercer, my best friend since our chaotic college days and a meticulous real estate notary. Rowan had been my absolute rock through the grueling escrow process, guiding me through the towering mountain of legal paperwork with absolute precision and unyielding patience. Halfway through the heavy meal, Rowan raised her glass of dark red wine. She tapped her silver fork against the delicate crystal rim, calling for the attention of the small room. Her smile was genuine and radiantly bright. She looked directly at me with deep, unmistakable pride, and told the entire table that watching me sign those final closing documents was the absolute highlight of her month. She joked loudly that my signature on that massive deed of trust was the most beautiful signature of an adult life, a permanent, legally binding mark of hard-earned independence. We all laughed in unison, raising our glasses to join the heartfelt toast. But the warm laughter died completely in my throat when I noticed my father leaning forward over his untouched plate. Graham rested his elbows heavily on the table, steepling his long fingers together. He locked his cold eyes on Rowan, suddenly highly engaged in the conversation. He adopted the smooth, non-threatening tone of a curious, older businessman, simply trying to understand the modern world, asking seemingly innocent questions about her specific line of work. He asked how the county clerk offices were handling the massive post-pandemic backlog of property transfers. He inquired, with frightening specificity, about the exact turnaround times for recording transfer deeds within the Marlow County system. Then, he smoothly shifted the conversation to the deep technicalities of her daily job. He asked extensive questions about electronic notarization protocols, questioning how secure the digital seals truly were, and how a notary legally verifies a person's identity when the physical presence of a seller is not strictly required by the new state laws. Rowan, ever the consummate professional, answered him politely and thoroughly. She explained the complex digital verification layers, the secure encrypted backups, and the stringent state regulations designed to prevent fraud. I watched my father nod slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he soaked in every single word. His questions were too sharp, too methodical, too perfectly structured. He was not making polite, idle dinner conversation to pass the time. He was actively gathering intelligence. Later in the evening, while I was carrying a heavy tray of empty ceramic plates back to the kitchen sink, I glanced out the window and saw my father wandering alone in the backyard. The bright motion sensor floodlight had clicked on, harshly illuminating the green lawn. Graham was standing near the far property line, holding his smartphone up in the air. He was taking pictures. I watched in stunned silence as he stepped backward, carefully framing the wooden fence, the narrow side access alley, and the exact distance between my garage and the neighboring property line. A cold, sharp prickle of intense annoyance washed over me. I wanted to march out there, rip the phone from his hands, and demand to know exactly what he thought he was doing. But I stopped myself. I took a deep, shaky breath and forced a desperate rationalization into my tired mind. I told myself he was just being his usual, insufferably boastful self. He was probably gathering photos to show off to his wealthy golf buddies at the country club tomorrow morning, bragging endlessly about the prime piece of real estate his smart daughter had managed to secure. It was a remarkably weak excuse, but it was the only one that kept me from screaming and ruining my own carefully planned party. As the long night finally wound down and the remaining guests began gathering their heavy coats, Graham lingered purposefully by the front door. He slowly buttoned his expensive wool coat, his cold eyes doing one final, sweeping assessment of the entryway. He turned to face me, his expression completely unreadable. He did not say he was proud of my massive accomplishment. He did not say the house was beautiful or warm. Instead, he adjusted his stiff collar and delivered a parting remark that felt exactly like a quiet, calculated threat disguised as casual financial advice. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that this house was far too good to just be a place to live. He let the heavy words hang in the silent air for a long second, before adding that the physical structure itself meant absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of wealth. "Land is the real value," he said, his voice dropping low and remarkably steady. He told me that many naive people simply do not understand that undeniable, brutal fact until someone else comes along and makes real money off it. He patted my shoulder once, a hollow, heavy-handed gesture completely devoid of any real affection, and walked out into the cool, damp night air. I closed the heavy door behind him and immediately locked the solid steel deadbolt, the loud metallic click echoing sharply in the suddenly quiet, empty house. I spent the next solid hour cleaning up the remnants of the party. I washed the delicate wine glasses, wiped down the large dining table, and put the expensive leftover food into the cold refrigerator. but I could not shake the heavy, suffocating feeling that had firmly settled over my tight chest. The hard-earned joy of the evening had been completely stripped away, leaving only a cold void. I turned off the bright living room lights and stood entirely alone in the dark, silent kitchen. The profound silence of the house, which I had so desperately craved and worked toward for 7 long years, now felt overwhelmingly oppressive and dangerous. I closed my tired eyes, but I could not block out the vivid image of my father. I saw him standing exactly where I was standing now, looking out the back window, his sharp mind running invisible, ruthless calculations. He had walked through my front door tonight, but he had never actually stepped into my home. He had stepped onto a potential job site. He had walked straight onto a corporate balance sheet. I tried desperately to push the rising anxiety away. I told myself I was wildly overreacting, my brain poisoned by years of reading worst-case scenarios in massive corporate contracts. I owned this beautiful house. My legal name was printed clearly on the deed. The locks were brand new. The heavy doors were completely secure. Yet, the deep unease remained, curling like toxic cold smoke in the pit of my nervous stomach. The polite smiles, the raised glasses, and the warm congratulations all felt like a terribly thin, fragile veneer covering a deep, catastrophic structural flaw. I went to bed that night staring blankly at the dark bedroom ceiling, listening closely to the unfamiliar, shifting creaks of the settling foundation. I wanted to feel incredibly safe. I wanted to feel victorious and untouchable. But all I felt was the lingering, undeniable, terrifying certainty that my own father was looking at my safe sanctuary and seeing absolutely nothing but an unexploited, highly valuable asset just waiting to be ruthlessly liquidated. Exactly 11 days later, the fragile illusion of my secure new life shattered into pieces. I was driving home from another exhausting 10-hour shift, my mind heavily preoccupied with standard contract revisions and vendor compliance clauses. I turned my car onto my quiet residential street, fully anticipating the comforting sight of my solid brick sanctuary. Instead, my right foot slammed down aggressively on the brake pedal before I even reached the edge of my driveway. The car jerked to a violent halt. Driven deep into the soft green grass of my front lawn were thick, brightly painted red wooden survey stakes. They formed a harsh, jagged geometric line cutting straight across my front property. Hammered violently into the ground near the side alley was a large, heavy-duty, corrugated plastic board. The bold, sterile corporate lettering declared it an active site acquisition by Vale Urban Redevelopment. And kneeling right on the welcoming mat of my front porch was a strange man wearing heavy canvas work pants. He was holding a metal measuring gauge, methodically sizing up the brass deadbolt of my solid front door. I threw the car into park, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I scrambled out of the driver's seat, my work heels clicking haphazardly on the concrete walkway. I loudly demanded to know exactly what he was doing on my private property. The man did not even flinch. He slowly stood up, wiped his calloused hands on a greasy blue rag, and looked at me with the bored, empty expression of a busy blue-collar worker who simply had a long job to finish. He spoke in a painfully casual tone, calmly informing me that he was just the scheduled locksmith. He said he was dispatched to physically swap out the exterior hardware because the new owner had officially completed the site takeover. I stared at him, my brain utterly refusing to process the English language. I told him he had the wrong address. I told him I was the legal owner. I pointed frantically to the solid brick walls, my voice involuntarily rising in pitch and volume. The locksmith simply shrugged his heavy shoulders, completely unbothered by my escalating panic. He pointed a thick, grease-stained finger toward a bright yellow piece of legal paper securely taped directly to the glass of my front window. He lazily advised me to call the management number, packed his metal tools back into a canvas bag, and walked back to his idling utility van. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely unlock my phone screen. I marched up to the window and stared at the posted legal notice. The bold black font formally warned against unauthorized entry. I dialed the local Marlow County phone number listed at the absolute bottom of the page. A woman answered on the second ring, her voice sickeningly cheerful and professionally detached. I gave her the address, my words tumbling out in a breathless, chaotic rush. I heard the sharp, rapid clacking of a computer keyboard on her end of the line. A few agonizing seconds later, the cheerful voice returned and effectively destroyed my entire reality. The project manager confidently confirmed, reading directly from her monitor, that the property asset had been successfully acquired by Briarcrest Redevelopment Limited Liability Company. She calmly stated that the full purchase amount had already been successfully wired into the designated title escrow account. Then, she delivered the final, suffocating blow. She casually informed me that my authorized post-sale occupancy timeline, a legal agreement I had never seen, let alone negotiated or signed, had officially expired at 8 o'clock this very morning. She politely advised me to vacate the premises immediately to avoid a formal law enforcement eviction process. I dropped the call. I did not step inside my house. I could not bear to look at the empty rooms I had bled for. I ran straight back to my car, the tires screeching loudly against the asphalt as I threw the transmission into reverse and sped out of the neighborhood. The tense drive to the Marlow County Recorder of Deeds office was a terrifying blur of hyperventilating breaths and blinding panic. I burst through the heavy glass doors of the government building just 30 minutes before their official closing time. I marched aggressively up to the front desk, slapped my state identification onto the counter, and demanded a fully certified copy of the latest property transfer deed for my specific parcel number. The indifferent county clerk took my payment and printed out a thick, heavy stack of stapled legal documents. I snatched the warm paper from her hands and retreated to a small, isolated wooden viewing desk in the far corner of the brightly lit, sterile room. I forced my trained, professional eyes to read the dense legal jargon, desperate to find the obvious clerical error. I prayed it was a mismatched parcel number or a catastrophic typo, but there was no error. It was all there, recorded permanently and legally into the official county archives. I flipped frantically to the primary transfer agreement. The listed grantor, the seller of the property, printed in stark, undeniable black ink, was Evelyn Phelps. The total consideration price listed for the sale of my home was $615,000. The physical room around me seemed to tilt violently on its axis. I felt a cold, nauseating sweat break out across the back of my neck and my tense shoulders. I turned quickly to the final page, the execution page, where the binding signatures lived. I stared hard at the blue ink hovering directly above my printed name. At a very brief, passing glance, it looked remarkably like my handwriting. But I evaluate legally binding corporate contracts for a living. I know the exact biomechanics and the deeply ingrained muscle memory of my own hand. The longer I stared at the page, the more the hideous forgery glaringly revealed itself. The sharp downward pull of the letter Y was far too deliberate and stiff, completely lacking my usual rushed, sweeping motion. The capital P was pitched completely vertical and rigid, entirely devoid of the slight rightward slant I always naturally created when signing my last name. It was not the fluid, messy stroke of a living person signing a routine document. It was a sterile, highly calculated replication. It looked exactly like someone had taken a high-resolution photograph of my genuine signature, placed a piece of thin tracing paper over it, and meticulously drawn the letters line by excruciating line. But the fake signature was only the very beginning of the living nightmare. My terrified eyes drifted slightly to the left side of the page, moving toward the legally required notarization block. The breath was violently knocked completely out of my lungs, leaving me gasping for air in the quiet government office. Stamped perfectly next to the forged blue ink was a digital notary seal. The name printed boldly in capital letters inside the rectangular border was Rowan Mercer. Directly beneath her printed name was a unique electronic notary authentication code, making the fraudulent document completely legally valid in the eyes of the state. The shock inside my chest instantly mutated from the sheer terror of a stolen physical asset into the profound, agonizing horror of deep, personal betrayal. My absolute best friend. The woman who had stood faithfully by my side for years, who knew every single painful detail of my financial struggles, whose name was now permanently embedded into the legal destruction of my life. It meant the coordinated attack had not come from a random, faceless corporate entity exploiting a loophole. It had come directly from deep inside my own trusted, intimate circle. My trembling fingers flipped erratically through the remaining pages of the thick packet. The architectural design of the fraud was breathtakingly comprehensive and deeply malicious. Attached as an official supporting exhibit was a full-color, highly detailed scan of my current state driver license. Appended directly to that was a sworn, legally binding affidavit of identity. The document blatantly lied, stating under the severe penalty of perjury that the seller had voluntarily appeared in person to physically execute the transfer deed. Whoever had engineered this hostile takeover had not merely faked a single piece of paper in a frantic moment of financial desperation. They had patiently constructed a multi-layered, airtight fortress of absolute perjury. They had anticipated every single procedural safeguard, bypassed every digital security measure, and built a perfect counterfeit reality designed specifically to crush me with the full, devastating weight of the law if I dared to raise a single objection. I stumbled blindly out of the county recorder office, pushing forcefully through the heavy exit doors into the harsh, glaring afternoon sunlight. The busy city noise around me sounded completely muffled, as if I were hopelessly trapped underwater. My chest heaved violently as I fought off a rising wave of sheer nausea. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket, my vision heavily blurring with hot, angry tears. I bypassed my recent contacts and aggressively dialed my father. The phone rang out loudly against my ear. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. It clicked over to his sterile, automated business voicemail. I ended the call immediately and dialed his number a second time. Again, the agonizing ringing echoed in my ear before dropping completely into the dead void of an unanswered machine. I stood completely frozen on the hard concrete sidewalk, completely paralyzed by the sheer, suffocating magnitude of what had just happened to my life. Then, my phone vibrated violently against my palm. A single text message notification flashed brightly across the glass screen. It was from Graham. I opened the message with shaking hands. There was no explanation. There was no panicked apology or desperate denial. There were only 2 short, chillingly calm sentences typing out on the screen. "Do not make a scene. We need to talk like adults." The sheer audacity of those specific words struck me like a physical blow to the face. The sickening paternal control was dripping aggressively from every single syllable. He had just stolen my secure sanctuary, liquidated my entire hard-earned net worth, and forged a massive mountain of federal and state documents. And yet, he was firmly demanding that I remain quiet and perfectly obedient. He was treating the catastrophic, illegal destruction of my independence like a minor, inconvenient family disagreement that I was currently overreacting to. He truly, genuinely believed I would just swallow the massive betrayal, follow his direct orders, and quietly comply. Growing up in the sprawling shadow of my father meant learning how to take up as little space as humanly possible in the rigidly established hierarchy of our family. I was assigned the permanent role of the reliable child. Being reliable did not mean I was cherished or celebrated. It meant I was the designated emotional and logistical shock absorber. While my older siblings were afforded the luxury of dramatic personal crises, expensive mistakes, and endless second chances, my fundamental purpose was strictly utilitarian. I was the one always expected to yield in every argument, to quietly correct the careless errors of others, to clean up the inevitable familial fallout, and above all else, to never become a financial or emotional liability. My silence and my absolute independence were the only things my father ever truly praised. Graham Phelps built his entire formidable identity around a company called Phelps Crafted Living. It was a high-end bespoke furniture manufacturing business that sold far more than just heavy oak dining tables and hand-stitched leather sofas. It sold an aspirational image of unyielding luxury, ironclad discipline, and resounding generational success to the outside world. My father was the quintessential self-made American man. He wore impeccably tailored dark suits, drove meticulously detailed leased luxury sedans, and spoke with the booming, resonant authority of a patriarch who naturally commanded absolute respect in every room he entered. He believed his own flawless marketing. He genuinely believed that because he controlled the corporate payroll, he inherently owned the unshakable loyalty and the complete autonomy of everyone connected to his bloodline. But the pristine, touged facade of Phelps-crafted living began to rot from the inside out several years ago. Following the massive global economic shifts of the pandemic, he made a series of wildly reckless corporate expansion decisions. He signed ironclad, multi-year commercial leases on massive new warehouse spaces just as the global supply chain completely collapsed. The lucrative high-volume corporate staging contracts that had kept his cash flow incredibly healthy vanished almost overnight. The sprawling industrial workshop that used to buzz constantly with dozens of highly skilled artisans was rapidly reduced to a desperate skeleton crew operating on a dangerously thin shoestring budget. To maintain the wealthy, untouchable illusion to his country club peers, he started taking out aggressive short-term loans with exorbitant interest rates. He was borrowing hot money just to keep the expensive lights on and the luxury car leases active. The fragile tension between us had truly fractured into open hostility exactly 2 years ago. He had invited me to a lavish, unnecessarily expensive lunch at a downtown steakhouse. Halfway through the heavy meal, between sips of expensive bourbon, he casually slid a thick stack of legal loan documents across the white linen tablecloth. It was a heavy guarantor agreement for a massive line of credit intended to purchase new automated manufacturing equipment. He framed the sudden request as a simple, everyday formality, a tiny administrative favor expected of a loyal daughter to help smooth out a temporary cash flow issue for the family business. But my daily existence revolves around dismantling complex contracts. I am professionally trained to spot the hidden traps that ruin lives. I picked up the silver pen he offered, but instead of signing blindly, I began to read the fine print. The debt structure he was casually asking me to anchor was a toxic, predatory trap. It was loaded with massive variable interest rates that could instantly double, hidden default triggers, and an enormous balloon payment that would have legally tethered my entire financial future to his rapidly sinking ship. If he missed a single payment, the aggressive lenders could immediately garnish my corporate salary and seize my modest retirement accounts. I pushed the heavy paperwork back across the table, looked him directly in the eye, and firmly refused to sign my name. From that specific afternoon onward, his entire perception of me shifted from passive indifference to active resentment. I was no longer just the quiet, reliable daughter. I became the unfilial child, simply because I understood entirely too much. It deeply infuriated him that I was significantly better at navigating the complex, unforgiving world of legal liabilities and risk assessment than he was. For decades, he had controlled our family narrative by positioning himself as the sole, unquestionable authority on business, wealth, and legal maneuvering. My sharp professional competence was a living, breathing challenge to his absolute monopoly on power. I was the walking proof that he was no longer the smartest or the most legally literate person in the room. He hated that I could read the exact pieces of paper that were actively destroying him. Standing alone on the hard concrete sidewalk outside the county recorder office, staring blankly at the text message demanding my silent obedience, the missing puzzle pieces of this current nightmare finally started snapping together with terrifying clarity. For the past 6 months, quiet, persistent whispers had been circulating through the local zoning board meetings and neighborhood watch groups about a massive urban redevelopment project targeting my specific area of Briar Glen. Aggressive corporate developers were quietly buying up continuous blocks of older, low-rise residential properties. Their ultimate goal was to demolish the aging single-family homes and build a sprawling, highly lucrative complex of modern, high-density luxury townhouses. My specific piece of land was the critical anchor point. My modest brick bungalow sat right at the exact corner intersection, acting as the sole physical barrier connecting two massive, separate parcels of newly acquired land. Without my specific lot, the entire multi-million-dollar townhouse project was completely stalled, bottlenecked by a single holdout property. With my lot, the wealthy developer instantly had a contiguous, unobstructed construction zone ready for immediate bulldozing. To a desperate man actively drowning in a deep ocean of toxic, maturing corporate debt, my safe sanctuary was never a home. It was a remarkably convenient, highly liquid asset sitting completely unprotected under a name he felt legally and morally entitled to control. Securing that $615,000 payout from the eager developers was his ultimate, final lifeline. Funneling that massive sum of cash through a fraudulent sale would easily cover his immediately maturing commercial bridge loans. It would keep the heavy doors of Phelps Crafted Living open for perhaps another 8 or 9 months. Most importantly, it would permanently preserve his sacred public image as a flawless, wealthy businessman who never failed. He truly believed that since he had paid for my childhood, he held an invisible, permanent lien against anything I would ever own. He reasoned that sacrificing my minor comfort to save his massive legacy was simply the natural order of the universe. A profound, icy calm suddenly washed over me, completely replacing the frantic, hyperventilating panic of the past hour. I finally understood the most terrifying truth of this entire ordeal. This massive, intricately coordinated fraud was not born from a sudden, chaotic moment of financial desperation. My father had not simply snapped under extreme pressure one random afternoon. He had methodically looked at the local property listings, calculated the exact square footage of my lot, and analyzed the lucrative zoning potential long before I ever sat down to sign my own closing documents. He had attended my housewarming dinner not as a proud parent celebrating his independent daughter, but as a hostile corporate raider quietly surveying his newly acquired territory. Every calculating glance at the fence line, every sharp question directed at the notary, every cruel comment about the true value of the dirt beneath my feet had been active, deliberate reconnaissance. He had viewed my home as a lucrative business opportunity before I had even packed my very first moving box. He had watched me pour 7 years of my absolute lifeblood into saving for that house, fully knowing the entire time that he was going to rip it away from me the very second the real estate market offered him a profitable exit strategy. I drove straight to Rowan apartment complex on the other side of town. The steering wheel felt like hot iron beneath my gripping hands, my knuckles turning completely white from the physical force. The evening traffic blurred into streaks of red and white light as I frantically weaved through the city streets. I was fully prepared for the most ruthless, devastating confrontation of my entire adult life. I marched up the 3 flights of concrete stairs to her door, my mind violently racing with vicious accusations. I pictured the exact way I would tear her down, the exact words I would use to destroy our decade of friendship. I pounded my fist heavily against the painted wood of her front door, the sound echoing loudly down the quiet hallway. When she opened the door, wearing oversized gray sweatpants and holding a half-empty ceramic mug of herbal tea, I shoved the thick stack of printed county documents directly against her chest. I demanded to know exactly how much my father had paid her to sell me out and ruin my life. I fully expected her to immediately flinch, to look away in shame, or to start crying in a pathetic, guilty defense. Instead, her reaction was pure, unfiltered panic. The ceramic mug slipped completely from her trembling fingers, shattering loudly against the hardwood floor. Warm liquid splashed aggressively across our shoes, but neither of us looked down. She scrambled backward, her eyes wide with genuine, absolute terror as she grabbed the heavy papers from my hand. She frantically scanned the final execution page, her eyes darting rapidly across the black ink, her face drained of all color, turning a sickening ashen gray. She looked up at me, her voice shaking violently, and swore on her own life that she had absolutely nothing to do with this horrific transaction. She reminded me of her ironclad professional boundary. She firmly stated that she never, under any circumstances, notarized legal documents for close friends or family members because it was a severe ethical risk zone she simply refused to cross. It was a rule she had preached to me 100 times before. I stepped aggressively into her apartment, slamming the heavy door shut behind me to block out the hallway. I pointed my finger directly at the digital notary stamp, printed clearly next to my forged signature. I demanded an explanation for her name and her unique identification number sitting right there in undeniable black and white. Rowan rushed over to her kitchen island, throwing the papers down under the bright overhead pendant light. She leaned over the counter, tracing her trembling index finger over the complex alphanumeric authentication code printed directly beneath her name. A sharp, terrified gasp escaped her throat. She gripped the edge of the marble counter as if she was going to be physically sick. She looked at me with hollow, terrified eyes and explained that the specific code on the county document did not belong to her primary daily digital credential. It was the exact alphanumeric sequence assigned exclusively to her emergency backup seal and her secondary digital certificate. She took a deep, jagged breath and told me that her entire secure backup kit, a small encrypted flash drive and a physical stamp, had gone completely missing exactly 18 days ago. My mind violently snapped back to that specific timeline. 18 days ago was the night of the massive, highly publicized charity fundraising gala hosted at the exclusive downtown social club where my father was a prominent honorary member. Rowan had been volunteering at the registration desk all night. I vividly remembered her mentioning the next morning that Graham had been exceptionally charming that evening, enthusiastically volunteering to help transport heavy boxes of donated goods back and forth through the chaotic, unsecured backstage employee area. He had unfettered physical access to the room where she kept her work bag. Rowan sprinted to her home office desk and frantically woke up her laptop monitor. Her fingers flew aggressively across the keyboard as she logged into her secure state notary portal. She printed out a single sheet of paper and practically shoved it into my hand. It was a formal, time-stamped confirmation receipt from the state notary board. She had officially reported the secondary seal and the digital certificate as stolen the very morning after the charity gala. That official report was filed days before the fraudulent house sale contract was ever drafted or signed. That single piece of paper was explosive. It meant that any legal document bearing that specific digital seal after the reported date was undeniably, unequivocally fraudulent in the eyes of the law. She had not betrayed me for a single second. Her professional identity had been ruthlessly weaponized, just like my personal assets. But the terrifying trail of stolen authority did not end there. Rowan dug much deeper into the administrative logs of her compromised digital account, pulling up the raw access history for the stolen credential. The secure system recorded the exact network location and the specific Internet protocol address where the fraudulent digital stamp had been successfully applied to the deed. The digital footprint led directly to the internal secure network of Crestline Title and Escrow, the specific company handling the financial escrow and the title transfer for the developer buying my land. Rowan hacked quickly into the public county property database to pull the full escrow officer assignment for the pending transaction. When the name of the file handler finally loaded on the bright screen, a second, much colder chill violently ripped down my spine, paralyzing my lungs. The name staring back at me in sterile gray font was Nolan Briggs. Nolan was my ex-boyfriend. We had dated for 2 turbulent, exhausting years before I finally ended things due to his chronic financial irresponsibility and his endless, suffocating lies. But during those 2 years, he had lived closely in my space. He knew my daily habits inside and out. He knew exactly how I signed my name when I was rushing out the door, and how I signed it when I was being incredibly careful on official documents. He knew exactly where I kept my sensitive physical documents hidden in the bottom drawer of the metal filing cabinet in my home office. Most terrifyingly, during the early stages of our relationship, when I first started the grueling pre-approval process for a mortgage, he had physically helped me scan my official state identification card, my tax returns, and my bank statements onto his own personal computer because my scanner was broken. I collapsed heavily onto Rowan's small living room sofa. The sheer, staggering weight of the conspiracy finally crushing the breath out of my lungs. In the span of one single evening, the horrifying reality of my situation completely shifted. I was not the victim of a random, isolated theft by a desperate stranger. I was not dealing with a simple, faceless corporate error that could be fixed with a few phone calls. My own father had meticulously gathered the darkest, most vulnerable fragments of my personal life and ruthlessly weaponized them against me. He took his all-consuming greed, his intense drive to dictate every outcome, and his profound understanding of my romantic history, engineering them into a perfectly designed emotional trap. He had approached Nolan, a man who already harbored deep, bitter resentment toward me, and who possessed the exact technical access needed to push a fraudulent title transfer smoothly through the escrow system. He had stolen the digital identity of my absolute closest friend to guarantee the forged paperwork would look flawlessly legitimate to any county clerk processing the file. He had engineered a perfect, closed-loop conspiracy. Every single piece of the intricate puzzle was designed to be completely untraceable back to Graham Phelps. If the massive fraud was ever discovered by the authorities, Nolan would take the devastating criminal fall for processing the bad paperwork, and Rowan would face a career-ending state investigation for the catastrophic misuse of her professional seal. My father would simply stand safely in the background, playing the role of a completely innocent bystander, quietly pocketing the massive payout while the people I used to trust tore each other apart in criminal court. It was a plan executed with such terrifying, clinical precision and absolute malice that it almost demanded a perverse kind of respect. He had built a flawless, inescapable legal cage, and he had intentionally used my own personal history as the unyielding iron bars. Every fiber of my being wanted to march straight into the nearest police precinct, slam the fraudulent documents onto the wooden desk, and scream until someone arrested my father. That is the natural human instinct when you are violently backed into a corner, but my entire professional career is built on mitigating catastrophic corporate disasters. I know how systems work. If I filed a loud, messy police report right now, Graham would immediately hire expensive defense attorneys, hide the money, and drag the investigation out for years while I remained effectively homeless. I needed a surgical strike, not a blind, emotional carpet bombing. Instead of the police station, I drove straight to the sleek, glass-paneled downtown offices of Voss Calder Legal. I did not need a friendly neighborhood lawyer to hold my hand. I needed a corporate predator. I asked specifically for Celia Voss, a senior partner renowned for viciously dismantling complex property fraud and hostile asset takeovers. Sitting in her immaculate corner office, overlooking the gray city skyline, I slid the thick stack of forged county records across her polished mahogany desk. Celia did not offer me a warm cup of coffee. She did not give me a patronizing look of pity or waste oxygen telling me how sorry she was that my own family had betrayed me. She simply put on her reading glasses and spent 20 silent minutes absorbing every single line of the fraudulent deed, the fake notarization, and the escrow instructions. The silence in the room was heavy and absolute. When she finally looked up, her expression was completely unreadable. She folded her hands neatly over the paperwork and asked me one single, defining question. She asked if I simply wanted to file a standard civil injunction to get the brick house back, or if I wanted to systematically annihilate the entire network of men who had orchestrated the theft. I looked directly into her cold, assessing eyes and told her I wanted them left with absolutely nothing. Our first tactical move was establishing undeniable scientific proof of the core crime. Within 3 hours, Celia had an emergency forensic handwriting expert sitting in her private conference room, analyzing the blue ink on the execution page under a high-powered digital microscope. The expert did not even need a full afternoon to reach a definitive conclusion. He pointed out the microscopic hesitations in the pen stroke, the unnatural pooling of ink at the top of the letters, and the complete lack of natural kinetic flow. He confidently stated that the signature was a textbook simulation. The forger had not memorized my signature from a distance. They had placed a thin sheet of translucent paper over an old physical sample and slowly, painstakingly traced it. He suggested the source material was likely a piece of personal correspondence, something with an isolated signature on a blank white background. A sickening realization immediately hit me. 2 years ago, I had given my father a blank, handwritten holiday card with a large, formal signature at the very bottom. He had kept it in his desk drawer, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to steal my identity. While the forensic expert drafted his sworn legal affidavit, Celia began ruthlessly peeling back the complex corporate layers of the buyer. She accessed restricted commercial databases to trace the financial origins of Briarcrest Redevelopment Limited Liability Company. It took her less than an hour to prove that the company was nothing more than a hollow paper shell. The actual capital funding the massive purchase flowed directly from a large holding firm controlled by Preston Vale. He was a notorious local real estate developer, infamous for aggressively buying out entire city blocks, bulldozing the existing older homes, and erecting high-density, incredibly lucrative residential townhouse complexes. But the most crucial piece of intelligence Celia uncovered was buried deep inside the confidential escrow wire instructions. The money had technically been deposited by Preston Vale, but the funds were currently frozen in a neutral, third-party holding account. The strict financial logs clearly dictated that Graham would only receive his massive broker commission and the final seller disbursement if, and only if, he delivered the physical property completely vacant and broom clean by early next week. That single hidden clause changed the entire dynamic of the war. My father did not actually have the money yet. He was currently standing on a highly unstable financial trapdoor. He had already promised the wealthy developer a clean, undisputed handover of the real estate. He was betting his entire failing manufacturing company, his suffocating bridge loans, and his pristine public reputation on one single, arrogant assumption. He was absolutely certain that I was too weak, too well trained in childhood submission, to ever fight back against his authority. He believed I would simply pack my cardboard boxes, surrender my front door keys, and walk away in defeated silence before the deadline. The final piece of the enemy infrastructure was the title company itself. We needed to know exactly how Nolan had managed to bypass the strict federal identity verification protocols without triggering an automatic internal audit. Working with a private digital investigator, Celia kept on retainer. We pulled the hidden metadata from the fraudulent identification packet filed with the county clerk. The digital footprint was remarkably sloppy. Nolan had used his high-level administrative credentials at the title agency to dig deep into an old, archived digital folder from a completely unrelated mortgage pre-approval application I had filed years ago. He had illegally downloaded a low-resolution scan of my driver license from their secure internal server and secretly attached it to the new sale documents. He used his professional title to rubber stamp the visual verification, falsely certifying to the county government that he had physically looked at my face in his office and legally confirmed my identity. I sat back in the heavy leather guest chair, absorbing the sheer, coordinated audacity of their plan. They had weaponized my past trust, my personal government documents, and my biological relationship to construct a seemingly flawless legal trap. Celia leaned across the mahogany desk, her voice dropping to a low, commanding whisper. She told me the absolute most important rule of the impending counterattack was total, unbroken radio silence. I was strictly forbidden from calling my father to scream at him. I was not allowed to send a single angry text message to Nolan. I could not post a single vague complaint on any social media platform, and I absolutely could not argue with any extended family members who might inevitably reach out. She explained that the most arrogant, confident predators always make their most catastrophic mistakes when they genuinely believe they have already won the game. If Graham thought I was quietly accepting my fate as the sacrificial lamb, he would proceed with the physical handover ceremony exactly as planned. He would gather his wealthy investors, he would stand proudly on my front lawn, and he would completely expose himself to the public trap. I walked out of the law firm as the late afternoon sun began to sink below the tall city buildings, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete pavement. The suffocating, frantic panic that had gripped my chest since I first saw the wooden survey stakes had completely evaporated. It was entirely gone, replaced by something entirely new. For the very first time since I pulled the forged deed from the county archives, my pain fundamentally changed its shape. It was no longer a chaotic, blinding terror that made me want to hide. It hardened. It cooled into something incredibly sharp, dense, and perfectly balanced. It felt exactly like a heavy, forged steel blade resting quietly in the palm of my hand. My father had spent my entire life teaching me to be quiet, to be reliable, and to never cause a public scene. He had trained me from childhood to be the perfect, silent victim for his ultimate financial rescue. But he had completely forgotten that I spent 50 hours every single week tearing apart airtight contracts and destroying people who thought they were legally untouchable. I was not going to run away from my own home. I was going to stand perfectly still, wait for him to step fully into the center of his own trap, and then I was going to pull the lever myself. I parked my car outside the sprawling industrial park that housed my father's business. As I pushed open the heavy metal doors of the main production facility, the thick, heavy scent of freshly cut mahogany and sharp chemical polyurethane varnish immediately assaulted my senses. For decades, that specific smell had represented absolute authority and unyielding success in our family. Today, however, it hung in the stale air like a desperate olfactory mask, a fragrant curtain trying and completely failing to cover up the undeniable truth of a rapidly dying enterprise. The massive factory floor, which used to be deafening with the roar of dozens of commercial saws and the shouted coordination of 50 skilled craftsmen, was eerily quiet. Only 3 men were working in the far corner, sweeping up piles of sawdust near a row of silent, dormant machines. I found Graham in his elevated glass office overlooking the empty floor. I walked in, closed the glass door firmly behind me, and sat down in the heavy leather chair opposite his massive wooden desk. I did not scream. I did not cry. I looked directly into his face and waited for him to speak. I expected at least a momentary flash of guilt, or perhaps a frantic, poorly constructed denial. But Graham did not deny anything. He did not even flinch. Instead, he smoothly pivoted, instantly deploying the polished corporate doublespeak he had perfected over 40 years in the cutthroat manufacturing industry. He leaned back in his expensive executive chair, steepled his long fingers together, and calmly reclassified an act of federal wire fraud as a totally normal, necessary commercial transaction. He did not use words like forgery or theft. He called it a strategic consolidation of family assets. He looked me dead in the eye, his voice dripping with condescending paternal authority, and promised that one day, when I finally matured enough to understand how the real world actually operated, I would thank him for stepping in and making the hard executive decisions. He had already constructed a bulletproof alternate reality, complete with a flawless, perfectly logical backstory ready to feed the nosy neighbors and our extensive network of extended relatives. He confidently told me his master narrative. He stated that my sudden, highly anticipated relocation to a new corporate office in Seattle was the perfect, unquestionable cover story. He spun a lie so detailed and so structurally sound that it almost sounded true to my own ears. He said everyone in his social circle already knew I was actively seeking a massive corporate promotion that would require a permanent transfer to the logistics branch on the West Coast. Because I was allegedly so overwhelmed with the impending, stressful cross-country move, I had simply begged my highly experienced, business-savvy father to handle the messy, complicated liquidation of my local real estate. It was a brilliant, sickeningly clean narrative. It completely erased my agency and perfectly positioned him as the selfless, heroic patriarch stepping in to rescue his stressed, overly ambitious daughter from a mountain of tedious paperwork. I forced my facial muscles to remain entirely blank, aggressively burying the burning, violent rage deep in my chest. I kept my breathing slow and my hands resting perfectly still on my lap, taking my stony, unbroken silence for passive submission. Graham pushed his narrative even further. He leaned heavily across the wide wooden desk, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, mentoring tone. He told me the developer he had brought in to buy the land was a highly serious, incredibly wealthy buyer who was going to single-handedly elevate the entire tax bracket of the surrounding neighborhood. He actually had the sheer, breathtaking audacity to tell me I should feel a deep sense of gratitude toward him. He claimed he had successfully optimized a stagnant, underperforming asset that I fundamentally lacked the financial vision and the sophisticated business acumen to fully exploit. In his twisted, incredibly arrogant mind, he was doing me a massive favor by liquidating my life savings. Then came the heavy emotional artillery. He deployed the exact same psychological weapon he had wielded against me since I was 7 years old. He lowered his voice to a quiet, lethal register, making sure every single word carried maximum destructive weight. He warned me that if I decided to throw a dramatic, emotional tantrum, if I selfishly chose to drag the local police or aggressive corporate lawyers into a private family matter, I would be entirely responsible for the catastrophic fallout. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture of our upcoming holiday dinners, assuring me that every single aunt, uncle, and cousin would look at me with absolute disgust. They would permanently brand me as the ungrateful, hysterical child who stubbornly tried to destroy her own father's massive legacy and bankrupt the family business over a few meaningless pieces of county paper. It was the ultimate test of my discipline. I let my shoulders physically slump forward. I dropped my gaze to the polished wooden floor, actively channeling the exact physical posture of the defeated, exhausted girl he fully expected to see. I let my voice crack just a fraction of an inch as I asked him, very quietly and very meekly, if I could at least have a few extra days to pack up my winter clothes and my fragile kitchen dishes. The transformation in his demeanor was instantaneous and entirely sickening. He immediately softened, his chest puffing out slightly as he eagerly assumed the role of the benevolent, generous king granting a minor, merciful pardon to a completely broken subject. He smiled, a warm, paternal expression that completely failed to reach his cold, calculating eyes, and told me he would personally ensure the new developers gave me until Sunday evening to clear out my personal belongings. He completely failed to realize that by formally granting me permission to stay in my own home for 2 more days, he had just definitively confessed to his absolute belief that he now owned it. Drunk on his own perceived, flawless victory, and eager to ensure I remained completely docile for the rest of the week, he decided to share his grand finale. He wanted to permanently lock in my compliance by showing me exactly how thoroughly and publicly he had outmaneuvered me. He casually mentioned that he was organizing a highly exclusive blessing brunch right on the front lawn of the property this coming Saturday morning. It was meant to be a sophisticated public relations event to formally celebrate the lucrative development partnership and hand over the physical keys. He proudly listed the prestigious guest roster. The wealthy developer would be there with his primary financial backers. The title escrow officer would be present. Several prominent local real estate brokers were invited. He had even asked a few of our most influential, wealthy relatives to attend, ensuring the seamless transfer of power had an audience of highly respected community witnesses. He told me I did not have to attend the brunch if it was too emotionally difficult for me to watch, offering me a coward's exit so I would not ruin his perfect morning. I stood up slowly from the leather guest chair. I nodded exactly 1 time, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the ground, and whispered that I just wanted all of this complex business to be over. I turned around, walked out of his glass office, and navigated the long, silent factory floor back to the bright, sunlit parking lot. I kept my head down and my posture thoroughly broken until I was safely locked inside the cabin of my own car. Only then, shielded by the tinted glass of my vehicle, did I allow a sharp, genuine, terrifying smile to finally cross my face. Graham truly thought he had successfully broken my spirit, silenced my objections, and permanently secured his stolen fortune. He had absolutely no idea that I had just willingly walked into the very center of his stronghold, played his exact psychological game flawlessly, and walked out with the single most valuable weapon in this entire war. I now had the exact date, the precise geographical location, and the complete, arrogant guest list for the very moment he was going to pull off his own mask in front of the world and completely destroy his own life. The following morning required a painful trip back to the sprawling suburban house where my late mother had lived. I needed to verify the exact source of the forgery. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the dusty, suffocatingly hot attic, pushing past heavy cardboard boxes until I found her ornate cedar keepsake trunk. She had always kept our most vital family documents securely locked inside. When I lifted the heavy brass latch, a sickening wave of violation washed over me. The soft velvet interior had been completely ransacked. Stacked birth certificates and old tax records were shoved back in a chaotic, disorganized mess. I dug frantically to the very bottom, searching for the small fireproof pouch where she kept our old travel documents. My expired international passport, the one I had heavily relied upon during my undergraduate study abroad program a decade ago, was entirely missing. That specific blue booklet was the absolute perfect source material for a desperate thief. It contained a clean, isolated signature on a stark white background and a clear identification photograph, all easily manipulated by anyone with basic scanning software. He had not merely stolen my future asset. He had physically violated the sacred remnants of my mother to secure his weapon. I drove back to my house with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. As I was walking up the concrete driveway, Mrs. Gable, the notoriously quiet elderly woman who lived 2 doors down, suddenly flagged me down. She scurried across the manicured lawns, her eyes darting nervously down the street as if she expected someone to jump out from the bushes. She leaned in uncomfortably close, her voice dropping to a harsh, conspiratorial whisper. She confessed that she had been watching my property closely. She told me she had clearly seen Graham walking around my front yard on 3 separate occasions last week. He was never alone. He had brought 2 different, highly aggressive-looking men wearing expensive tailored suits. She watched them pace the exact perimeter of my property, measure the critical construction setbacks with a digital laser tape, and take dozens of high-resolution photographs of my wooden fences and the structural foundation. He was personally conducting private, highly lucrative developer tours of my sanctuary while I was completely oblivious, sitting perfectly still in my corporate office. The structural integrity of his lies continued to collapse when I arrived at the downtown law firm later that afternoon. Celia was already waiting for me in the sterile glass conference room, a single, incredibly thick document isolated in the center of the dark mahogany table. She had spent the entire morning aggressively digging through the auxiliary municipal zoning filings and discovered a hidden easement appendix deeply buried beneath the primary title transfer. It was a highly technical, profoundly obscure legal concession granting the future commercial developer unlimited structural access to the municipal utility lines running straight through my backyard. Approving that specific, quiet easement instantly bypassed years of bureaucratic red tape and immediately increased the commercial development value of the dirt by hundreds of thousands of dollars. And sitting quietly at the very bottom of that obscure, deeply buried appendix was another flawless, completely forged copy of my signature. The digital web thickened even further just an hour later when Rowan called my cell phone, her voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated adrenaline. She had spent the entire night running a grueling, deep diagnostic recovery sequence on her compromised state notary portal. She dug past the surface-level access logs and found a fragmented glitch hidden deep inside the system architecture. When the fake digital seal was maliciously applied at the title office, the software had accidentally triggered a localized, 10-second audio recording from the computer microphone due to an obscure accessibility feature error. Rowan played the recovered audio file over the speakerphone. The sound quality was terrible, heavily distorted by static and the loud hum of a commercial air conditioner, but the specific voices were entirely unmistakable. I heard Nolan clearly state that I was too busy and would never bother reading down to the final appendix. A second later, my father responded. His deep, gravelly voice cut through the static, coldly stating that he did not care about the paperwork details as long as the physical keys were resting securely in his hands before Monday morning. The sheer, crushing pressure of the collapsing lie finally began to crack the foundation on the opposite side of the battlefield. Exactly at midnight, the The harsh ringing of my phone shattered the silence of my dark bedroom. It was Lila, the second wife of my father. Her voice was trembling uncontrollably, thick with severe exhaustion and blind panic. She did not outright confess to knowing about the massive document forgery, but her terrified, frantic rambling indirectly confirmed the absolute worst. She tearfully admitted that the commercial bridge lenders were aggressively circling the manufacturing company like starving wolves. She confessed that the actual corporate debt was astronomically higher than Graham had ever admitted to the family. She said incredibly intimidating men in dark suits had been showing up at their private gated residence, demanding immediate massive cash payments. In her desperate state, she let a catastrophic detail slip. She blurted out that Graham had firmly promised Preston Vale a massive, highly public brunch event to formally showcase the clean title and prove the absolute lack of any internal family disputes over the land. He had legally and socially backed himself into a corner where he absolutely had to deliver the physical property in front of the town elite. If he failed to produce the keys and the compliant daughter at that specific brunch, the wealthy developer would instantly pull the massive funding, and the bridge lenders would completely devour his company by Monday afternoon. He had gone entirely too far to simply cancel the event or quietly back out of the fraudulent deal. Just as I ended the exhausting call with Lila, a silent notification illuminated my phone screen. An anonymous email had bypassed my strict spam filter. The sender address was a random, meaningless string of numbers, but the subject line contained my exact street address. Attached was a single digital file. It was a scanned copy of page 47 from the title escrow packet, the exact page that had been mysteriously missing from the official file I had pulled at the county clerk office. I opened the file and stared at the glowing screen in pure, paralyzing horror. It was a digital screenshot taken during a secure remote video verification session. The woman sitting in the digital frame was absolutely not me. She was wearing a cheap brown wig styled to mimic my exact haircut, oversized dark-framed glasses that obscured half her facial features, and sitting in an incredibly dim, poorly lit room. But she was holding up my stolen driver license directly to the web camera. Nolan had engineered a fake remote identity check to satisfy the strict federal banking regulations. And now, completely consumed by his own cowardice, he was anonymously feeding me the raw proof of his own federal crime, desperately hoping I would offer him leniency when the legal walls finally fell. I locked my phone and sat completely still in the dark. Every single disparate piece of the puzzle had finally locked violently into place, pointing directly at the exact same target. My father had not just traced my name on a single piece of paper in a fleeting moment of financial panic. He had systematically and ruthlessly constructed an entirely temporary human identity. He used stolen federal documents, exploited his old social connections, leveraged a desperate and weak ex-boyfriend, and manipulated professional legal systems to quietly sell my safe sanctuary like a bulk commodity in a corporate zoning project. He had built a massive, intricate machine of pure deception just to crush me. The legal machinery we built over the next 48 hours was designed to be completely invisible until the exact moment it clamped shut. My goal was no longer about winning an argument against my father in a private room. You cannot argue with a man who fundamentally believes he owns your existence. My ultimate plan was simply to hand him the pen and let him proudly sign his own name to his absolute destruction. In the sterile quiet of her downtown corner office, Celia executed our first critical maneuver. She drafted a massive, highly aggressive motion to completely freeze the pending real estate transaction, but filing the injunction immediately would have been a catastrophic tactical error. If the escrow officers or my father received a formal legal notice on a Wednesday afternoon, they would have ample time to panic. They would instantly start shredding physical documents, deleting internal server logs, and frantically coordinating their fake stories to protect themselves. Instead, Celia deliberately held the finished paperwork on her desk. She intended to file it with the emergency county judge at the very last possible second, ensuring the legal freeze hit the system exactly when all the guilty parties were standing together in the open air, utterly unable to hide. While Celia controlled the courtroom strategy, Rowan was meticulously building an impenetrable fortress around her own professional identity. She spent hours sitting at my dining room table, drafting a comprehensive, sworn legal affidavit that detailed every single violation. She documented the exact minute she discovered her secondary credential kit was missing. She attached the official state board notification proving she had formally reported the theft days before the fake sale was ever initiated. She included the highly technical system architecture logs, showing the fraudulent digital login originating directly from the internal network of the title agency. She laid out the strict ethical guidelines of her profession, proving definitively that a legitimate notary would never blindly authorize a massive property transfer without being physically present in the room with the seller. Her document was not just a defense, it was a loaded weapon aimed directly at the people who had stolen her name. The sheer scale of the coordinated forgery gave Celia the necessary leverage to quietly invite a specialized municipal authority into our circle. She reached out directly to the senior investigator of the local property fraud division. She presented them with the recovered audio files, the fake remote verification photographs, and the hidden municipal easement appendices. The investigators were incredibly eager to dismantle a sophisticated local crime ring, but they agreed to operate entirely in the shadows. Celia gave me one strict, unyielding directive. I had to let my father continue to believe that his grand plan was executing flawlessly. I had to swallow every single ounce of my burning rage and play the exact role he had scripted for me. I had to be the broken, terrified daughter who had simply given up the fight. I returned to my brick bungalow and began the excruciating process of staging my own defeat. I quietly packed up my most valuable personal possessions in the dead of night. I boxed up my irreplaceable family photographs, my expensive electronic equipment, and my sensitive financial records, hiding them securely in the trunk of my car. But I intentionally left the rest of the house looking exactly like the residence of a woman who was too emotionally paralyzed to properly pack. I left dirty dishes piled haphazardly in the kitchen sink. I draped wrinkled clothing over the backs of the living room chairs. I left moving boxes half-taped and completely empty in the center of the hallway. I meticulously crafted the physical illusion of total surrender. It was the exact depressing, defeated environment that Graham expected to find. He needed to look through my front window and see a victim who had been successfully crushed by his overwhelming authority. Outside the quiet walls of my home, my father was aggressively controlling the social narrative. He spent his entire week making lengthy phone calls to our extensive network of extended relatives and his wealthy country club associates. He proactively planted the seeds of his own fake reality. He told my aunts and uncles that I had officially accepted a highly demanding corporate career opportunity on the distant West Coast. He painted a vibrant picture of a daughter who was simply too overwhelmed by the sudden professional transition to handle the tedious liquidation of her local assets. He told them he was magnanimously stepping in to manage the complex real estate transaction, so I could focus entirely on my bright corporate future. He was thoroughly convinced that by spreading the lie first, he would permanently insulate himself from any future accusations. He was laying the social groundwork for his victory parade. Simultaneously, Preston Vale was transforming my stolen sanctuary into a lavish marketing opportunity. The wealthy developer saw the upcoming handover not just as a routine property acquisition, but as a critical public relations event for his massive townhouse project. He hired an expensive local catering company to set up long tables on my front lawn for a sophisticated Saturday morning brunch. He ordered premium sparkling wine, expensive imported cheeses, and delicate pastries. He arranged for his marketing team to erect large wooden easels on my grass, displaying incredibly detailed architectural renderings of the luxurious complex he planned to build over the ruins of my home. He officially invited his primary financial investors, several high-profile local real estate brokers, and key members of the municipal zoning board. He wanted a captive, wealthy audience to witness the seamless acquisition of the final puzzle piece. When Celia discovered the extravagant plans for the brunch, I fully expected her to immediately file the injunction and shut the entire circus down. But the senior partner simply leaned back in her leather chair and smiled a cold, calculating smile. She explained that we were absolutely not going to block the event. She told me that stopping the transaction in a quiet, private office would only solve half the problem. My father was a man who had built his entire identity, his business empire, and his psychological dominance on his pristine public image. He drew his power from the admiration and respect of his wealthy peers. If we destroyed his scheme in private, he would simply spin a new lie and continue to play the victim. Celia knew that a crowded front lawn, completely filled with important municipal officials, wealthy financial investors, and dozens of high-definition cell phone cameras, was the absolute perfect execution block. I formally agreed to attend the Saturday morning brunch. I sent a short, emotionally hollow text message to my father, confirming that I would be there precisely on time to officially conclude the business. He immediately replied with a condescending note of approval, praising me for finally acting like a rational adult. He genuinely believed I was walking out onto that manicured grass to hand over the brass keys, lower my head in shame, and quietly disappear from his newly acquired territory. He had absolutely no idea that I was not showing up to surrender. I was stepping onto that lawn as the undisputed legal owner of the property, armed with a mountain of forensic evidence, backed by sworn municipal investigators, and perfectly positioned to orchestrate the most devastating public collapse of his entire life. The legal machine was completely assembled, the jaws were pulled back to the maximum tension, and all I had to do was wait for the sun to rise. The crisp morning air of that Saturday carried a deceptive stillness. I was not parked in my own driveway. I was sitting 2 full blocks away, hidden safely behind the heavily tinted windows of a massive black sport utility vehicle that Celia had lent me specifically for this morning. The engine was turned completely off, leaving the interior of the car completely silent. The cabin smelled faintly of expensive leather and stale black coffee. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat with my hands resting loosely on the bottom curve of the steering wheel, watching the entrance of Briar Glen through the wide windshield. Every luxury sedan and sleek black town car that made the slow, deliberate turn onto my quiet suburban street looked exactly like a polished wooden chess piece sliding flawlessly into its predetermined position on a very dangerous board. Down the street, the physical reality of my front yard had been completely erased. The modest, quiet green lawn I had meticulously watered and mowed every single weekend was fully transformed into a vulgar, highly theatrical stage designed exclusively to celebrate the absolute greed of other men. Several high-top cocktail tables were scattered strategically across the grass, each draped in pristine white linen tablecloths that fluttered softly in the gentle morning breeze. Hired catering staff wearing matching black vests and crisp white dress shirts navigated gracefully through the rapidly gathering crowd. They balanced heavy silver trays loaded with tall crystal-fluted glasses, filled with bright orange mimosas and sparkling water. Towering ominously over the cocktail tables were heavy wooden easels holding massive, glossy architectural renderings. They depicted the sprawling, soulless luxury townhouse complex that would soon physically crush my brick bungalow into dust. They had turned the site of my greatest personal achievement into a cheap, temporary marketing pavilion. At the absolute center of the circulating crowd stood Graham. He was dressed in a remarkably sharp, perfectly tailored dark blue blazer and a heavily starched white dress shirt, looking every inch the triumphant corporate titan he so desperately needed the world to believe he was. He moved effortlessly between the small clusters of wealthy guests, radiating an intoxicating, magnetic energy. This was the exact environment where he thrived and fed his enormous ego. I watched him throw his head back in a loud, booming laugh that echoed clearly down the quiet, tree-lined street. He aggressively shook hands with local politicians and affluent neighborhood brokers, clapping them heavily on the shoulder. He kept pointing his manicured fingers at the solid brick walls and the wide roofline of my home, gesturing broadly as he mapped out the impending demolition to his captivated audience. He was presenting the real estate with the casual, arrogant ownership of a man who had never once considered the devastating human cost of his theft. Looking at him from a distance, surrounded by his adoring peers, you would never guess the property he was so proudly auctioning off belonged to his own flesh and blood. A few minutes later, a long silver luxury vehicle pulled up to the curb directly in front of the makeshift celebration. Preston Vale stepped out, closely followed by a tight-knit group of his primary financial investors and suited legal advisors. The wealthy developer possessed the sleek, polished look of an apex predator perfectly comfortable at the absolute top of the commercial food chain. He carried a thick, handsome leather portfolio tucked securely under his left arm. Inside that portfolio rested the final, binding legal agreements and a ceremonial financial check representing the massive broker commission destined for my father. The delivery of a completely clean, undisputed title and a vacant physical structure was the only remaining hurdle standing between Graham and his desperately needed financial salvation. Shortly after the wealthy developer arrived, Nolan Briggs walked slowly onto the grass. The sheer physical contrast between his terrified demeanor and the festive, celebratory atmosphere was incredibly stark. He was wearing a standard gray business suit, clutching a slim black leather briefcase tightly against his chest like a physical shield meant to block incoming fire. Even from my distant vantage point inside the parked vehicle, I could clearly see that his face was shockingly pale, possessing a sickly, ashen quality. He looked exactly like a terrified man desperately forcing himself to march toward his own scheduled execution. He offered a few weak, trembling smiles to the catering staff and tried to blend into the periphery of the wealthy crowd, desperately trying to maintain the professional, unbothered facade of a routine title escrow officer completing a standard weekend assignment. He was a coward waiting for the floor to drop. The carefully orchestrated dynamic of the party shifted violently just a few moments later. Rowan appeared at the edge of the property line. She had not sent a response to the invitation because she had never received one. She walked slowly up the concrete sidewalk wearing a severe, impeccably cut dark charcoal suit. Her posture was rigidly straight, her facial expression completely devoid of any warmth, polite courtesy, or social grace. She did not grab a drink from the passing silver trays. She did not engage in small talk with the wealthy investors or the neighborhood gossips. She simply stood near the front walkway, a silent, terrifying monolith of absolute accountability. When Nolan finally turned his head and caught sight of her standing there, his entire body violently, completely froze. The weak, fake smile instantly vanished from his pale face. He stumbled backward half a step, nearly knocking over a tall cocktail table covered in crystal glasses. The sheer, overwhelming weight of her sudden physical presence in that yard was enough to mentally break him before a single word was even spoken. Inside the dark cabin of the borrowed vehicle, my phone screen suddenly illuminated the center console. It vibrated exactly one time against the hard plastic tray. I looked down and read the single, incredibly precise text message sent from Celia. The directive consisted of exactly one sentence. She told me to wait patiently until he physically held the keys in his hand and verbally confirmed his absolute ownership of the property one last time. I locked my phone screen, plunging the cabin back into relative darkness, and tossed the device onto the passenger seat. I turned my eyes back to the festive stage unfolding on my lawn. Graham was making his final, fatal move. He smoothly separated himself from the wealthy developer and confidently stepped up onto the raised concrete platform of my front porch. He raised both of his hands high in the air, a broad, winning smile plastered across his face, signaling for the loud chatter of the affluent crowd to settle down. The investors, the brokers, and the catering staff all turned their attention toward the confident patriarch standing proudly on the steps. He reached deep into the right pocket of his dark blue blazer. When he pulled his hand back out, the morning sunlight caught the bright, unmistakable reflection of solid brass. He was holding my house keys, the exact keys I had tirelessly worked 7 agonizingly long years to earn with my own blood and sweat. He held them high in the air, dangling them casually from his fingers as if they were nothing more than a cheap, meaningless trophy he had won in a rigged carnival game. He turned his body slightly to the right, gesturing warmly toward Preston Vale, preparing to deliver his triumphant speech and formally sign the final fraudulent handover protocol on the portable wooden podium set up near the front door. The air in my lungs felt incredibly cold and perfectly clear. The suffocating anxiety that had plagued my every waking moment for the past several weeks was entirely gone. I reached over, gripped the heavy chrome handle of the driver's side door, and pulled. The heavy metal latch clicked open with a satisfying, decisive sound. I pushed the heavy door wide open, stepped out of the hidden shadows of the vehicle, and planted my feet firmly onto the sunlit concrete pavement. I did not rush. I closed the car door behind me and began the long, deliberate walk down the center of the street, heading straight toward the crowded lawn where my father was standing completely oblivious to the massive, undeniable avalanche of truth that was about to violently crush his entire world. I walked straight up the center of the concrete driveway. I did not run toward the porch. I did not scream out his name or throw my hands in the air to cause a frantic scene. The steady click of my shoes against the pavement was a slow, deliberate drumbeat cutting sharply through the polite, wealthy chatter of the morning brunch. The affluent guests closest to the sidewalk parted automatically, their eyes drawn to the sudden, uninvited disruption, creating a narrow, perfectly clear path directly to the front stairs of my home. Graham was still standing elevated on the top step, the bright brass keys dangling loosely from his right hand, his face frozen mid-laugh as he noticed my approach. I stopped exactly 6 feet away from the bottom of the stairs. The murmurs of the wealthy crowd began to die down rapidly, the attendees sensing the sudden, drastic shift in the atmospheric pressure of the event. I looked my father directly in the eyes, refusing to blink, refusing to offer even a fraction of the submission he expected. My voice was not loud, but the sheer coldness of it carried perfectly across the suddenly silent lawn. I asked him to look at the wealthy investors, the local real estate brokers, and the neighborhood residents gathered on my property, and repeat his story. I demanded that he state, loud and clear for every single witness to hear, that I had voluntarily agreed to sell my home to Preston Vale. For exactly 3 long seconds, Graham maintained his bulletproof, arrogant facade. His trademark, charismatic smile stretched tightly back across his face. He let out a soft, patronizing chuckle and took a single step forward, raising his free hand in a calming paternal gesture. He started to speak, falling back effortlessly on his meticulously crafted narrative about my highly demanding corporate relocation to the West Coast, and how the extreme stress of the impending move had simply overwhelmed my delicate nerves. He was actively preparing to play the role of the patient, forgiving father dealing with a hysterical, confused daughter who had gotten cold feet at the very last minute. But his lying words died abruptly in his throat. The polished, arrogant smile completely vanished from his face, replaced rapidly by a sudden, sickening, pale hollow. He was no longer looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the street directly behind my shoulders. Coming up the driveway was Celia. She was flanked tightly by 2 stern, broad-shouldered investigators from the County Property Fraud Division wearing dark windbreakers, alongside a formal representative from the State Notary Board carrying a thick leather binder. Celia did not politely excuse herself as she pushed aggressively through the crowd of frozen, bewildered developers. She walked straight up to the wooden presentation podium, pulled a thick stack of aggressively stamped legal documents from her briefcase, and slammed them heavily onto the flat surface. She loudly announced to Preston Vale and the entire stunned assembly that an emergency immediate freeze order had just been fully executed by a municipal judge, halting the escrow transfer and completely invalidating the pending real estate transaction. The silence that fell over the front lawn was absolute and entirely deafening. Rowan stepped forward from the edge of the property line, her dark charcoal suit a stark contrast against the bright morning sun and the white linen tables. She did not look at my father. She addressed the state representative and the wealthy crowd directly, her voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable professional authority. She publicly declared that the digital authorization stamp pressed onto the county transfer deed was generated from her emergency secondary kit. She stated firmly that the specific kit was officially reported stolen exactly 18 days before the fraudulent contract was ever drafted or signed. She made it unequivocally clear to the wealthy developer and his expensive legal team that any financial document bearing that specific digital signature after the reported date was a direct product of felony forgery. Graham opened his mouth, his mind desperately searching for a new lie to plug the massive, sinking hole in his alternate reality. But Celia did not give him a single second to breathe. The legal guillotine was already dropping, and she was pulling the rope. She pulled out the heavily documented proof for the entire crowd to see. She presented the digital login logs, proving the fake notary seal was accessed directly from the internal computer network of Crestline Title and Escrow. She pulled out the certified forensic handwriting analysis that definitively proved my signature was a traced, microscopic forgery. She laid out the unauthorized access records showing exactly when my expired identification documents were illegally downloaded from a secured digital server. She pinned every single piece of devastating evidence directly onto the chest of Nolan Briggs, completely destroying the safe, anonymous shadow he thought he could comfortably hide within. The sheer, crushing weight of the sudden, irrefutable evidence broke Nolan instantly. He did not even attempt to mount a defense or deny his involvement. His knees physically buckled, and he sagged heavily against one of the white cocktail tables, nearly knocking over a tray of expensive glassware. He started babbling uncontrollably, his voice cracking in sheer, unadulterated panic. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my father standing frozen on the porch. Nolan loudly confessed to the entire silent crowd that Graham had specifically targeted him months ago. He admitted that my father had ruthlessly exploited an old, significant financial debt he owed, promising complete financial forgiveness if he just quietly pushed the fake paperwork through the escrow verification system. Nolan cried out that Graham had assured him the plan was absolutely foolproof because I was too deeply conditioned, too weak, and too terrified to ever dare drag my own flesh and blood into a public courtroom. The confession cascaded into an even larger disaster on the lawn. Nolan turned his panicked, tear-filled eyes toward Preston Vale, frantically trying to drag the powerful developer down into the mud with him. He blurted out that Preston knew exactly what was happening the entire time. He claimed the wealthy developer was fully aware that the entire lucrative transaction was being exclusively orchestrated and aggressively negotiated by Graham, completely bypassing the actual, legally registered homeowner. Preston instantly turned a horrifying shade of gray. The developer realized in real time that his massive, highly publicized neighborhood revitalization project had just violently mutated into a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar federal conspiracy lawsuit. His own investors were staring at him with undisguised horror. Every single guest on the lawn stood completely paralyzed. The high-definition cell phone cameras that had been happily recording a sophisticated, luxurious handover ceremony just 2 minutes ago were now recording a completely different movie. They were documenting a supposedly untouchable, wealthy patriarch being brutally stripped of his lies, exposed as a desperate criminal who had forged government documents to sell the very roof from over his own daughter. The reality of his total, inescapable destruction finally pierced Graham. The polished, impenetrable armor of his ego shattered into a million jagged pieces, leaving nothing but a terrified, drowning man. He stumbled down the single concrete step, leaving the wooden podium behind. He reached out with trembling hands, trying desperately to close the physical distance between us. His voice lost all its booming, commanding authority, reducing instantly to a pathetic, ragged plea. He called my name over and over again. He invoked our shared bloodline, begging me to remember that we were family and that family protects each other. He frantically explained to me, and to the entire crowd watching, that he just needed a little bit more time, just one final, massive injection of cash to save the manufacturing company from being completely devoured by the aggressive commercial bridge lenders. He pleaded that he never truly wanted to hurt me, but the business simply had to survive at all costs. He was so blinded by his own overwhelming panic that he completely failed to realize exactly what he was doing. By desperately begging for mercy and trying to justify his actions with his failing business, he was publicly confirming his exact financial motive. He was confessing to his intentional, premeditated control over my assets directly in front of the two sworn county investigators standing right beside me. He was driving the final, fatal nail into his own coffin with his own desperate, terrified words. The heavy brass keys slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the hard concrete porch with a sharp, metallic clatter that echoed loudly in the stunned silence of the morning. The two investigators stepped forward, moving with practiced, undeniable authority. One of them pulled Nolan Briggs away from the cocktail table, physically separating him from the crowd, to immediately begin taking his formal recorded statement. The other investigator stepped directly in front of my father, completely blocking his path to me. In a calm, flat, devastatingly professional voice, the officer began reading Graham his Miranda rights. I did not stay to watch them place the cold metal cuffs on his wrists. I walked past the investigator, past the frozen, sweating developer, and stepped up onto my own front porch. I knelt down on the hard concrete and closed my fingers tightly around the warm brass of my house keys. I stood back up and looked down at the man who had spent my entire life trying to make me small, trying to mold me into a convenient tool for his own success. He was looking up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and total disbelief. He still could not comprehend that the quiet, reliable daughter he had dismissed for 3 decades had finally built a trap he could not escape. I held the keys tightly in my hand, feeling the solid, sharp edges bite reassuringly into my palm. I looked directly into his panicked eyes and delivered the final sentence of our relationship. You did not sell my house. You just sold the last remaining piece of your dignity. Thank you everyone for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below letting me know your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.